It's kind of amazing when you think about it, the term World War. Its first recorded use in English wasn't like after 1918.
No, not at all.
It was way back, 1848, I think,
Right.
describing a potential war between the big European powers.
That's right. It really makes you pause and consider how that idea, that sort of shadow of a massive conflict, was already forming decades before the event we actually call the First World War.
Exactly. It wasn't just this sudden thing in 1914. It feels more like a growing awareness.
A growing awareness, yes, that conflicts involving these major players, well, they just inherently carried this potential to spread globally, even if the fighting wasn't literally everywhere at once.
Right. And that's really where we want to focus today on seeking history. We're not just jumping into the trenches of 1914.
We're digging a bit deeper.
We're looking at the conflicts that came before that, these earlier wars, often incredibly brutal, that sort of piece by piece, laid the groundwork for what became this, unprecedented global war. Like clues, really.
Exactly. Clues in a massive historical puzzle. And what's so interesting, I think, is that these clues, they're not just military or political.
Oh, yeah.
They go way beyond that. These earlier wars, they triggered huge societal changes. They reshaped economies. They sparked new ways of thinking sociologically and even impacted how businesses operated globally. It's all connected.
So, okay, this early idea of a world war shifting from just a war among great powers to something inevitably global, what really drove that change? What were the engines behind it?
Well, you have to look at the late 19th, early 20th century. The Second Industrial Revolution was just roaring ahead, right?
Right.
And globalization was picking up speed like never before.
Okay.
Think about the advancements. Mass production of weapons, deadlier weapons, navies that could project power across oceans. And this increasingly tight global network trade, telegraphs for instant communication, finance.
So it wasn't just about who was fighting, but the means they had, the scale of their reach.
Precisely. The big powers had these huge colonial empires scattered all over the place. And they were tangled up in this complex web of alliances.
Ah, the alliances, right?
Which meant even a small local flare-up could just escalate. Drag in allies, spread to colonies where resources were vital. Colonies became targets. It was like setting up dominoes, just waiting for the first push.
It paints a picture of a world getting smaller, more connected, but maybe also more fragile, more vulnerable to widespread war.
I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yeah.
More interconnected, more volatile.
Okay, let's dive into some of those earlier flashpoints then. The mid-19th century seems like a really crucial period.
Oh, absolutely. The Crimean War, 1853 to 56, that's a fantastic early example. Now, it wasn't a world war like we think of it now, but its international impact. Profound.
The Crimean War. Okay, so that was Russia against the Ottoman Empire, Britain, France, Sardinia, Piedmont. Quite a lineup. What was the core issue there?
At its heart was the Eastern question. Basically, the long, slow decline of the Ottoman Empire and the resulting scramble among the European powers. Who would benefit? Who would lose out?
Okay.
Russia wanted to expand southwards. Britain and France wanted to maintain a balance of power, stop Russia getting too strong. The immediate trigger, Russia marching into Moldavia and Wallachia, Ottoman territories.
Right. And we hear about these incredibly fierce battles, Alma, Balaclava, the Charge of the Light Brigade, obviously. And the siege of Sevastopol sounds just horrendous. What came out of it, militarily and politically?
Militarily, it was a shock for many. It really showed how outdated Russia's military was. But it also showcased new tech that would change everything.
Like what?
Explosive naval shells, railways for logistics, getting troops and supplies moved long distances, and the telegraph for battlefield communication.
Wow, okay.
But it also gave this grim preview of trench warfare. It showed Napoleonic tactics were basically useless against things like rifled muskets and better artillery. The big takeaway: technology was racing ahead, but military thinking, it was lagging way behind, a dangerous gap.
Yeah, that sounds dangerous. And the diplomatic fallout, the treaties.
The Treaty of Paris in 1856 really shook things up. Russia took a big hit to its prestige, which actually pushed them towards internal reforms like freeing the serfs, believe it or not.
Interesting.
France felt its influence grow. Austria kind of messed up by staying neutral and annoyed everyone.
Oops.
Yeah. And importantly, it highlighted just how weak the Ottoman Empire was becoming. And by shifting that power balance in Europe, it sort of unintentionally paved the way for Italy and Germany to unify later on. Big long-term consequences.
So beyond the fighting and the politics, did Crimea have other impacts? Like on society, maybe even business?
Oh, absolutely. This is where Florence Nightingale becomes famous, right? Her work on battlefield medicine. The hospital conditions were just appalling, and her work basically revolutionized nursing. It laid the groundwork for the Red Cross.
That's huge.
And you also get the first real war photography, Roger Fenton, showing people back home what it actually looked like. Plus, proper war journalism, William Howard Russell sending back these critical reports. It brought the human cost home like never before, really shaped public opinion.
A real turning point then, on so many levels. Okay, let's hop across the Atlantic. The American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Mostly internal, but another war showing how warfare was changing.
Definitely. The Civil War, yeah, primarily domestic, but it became this massive demonstration of industrialized war, using technology on a huge scale.
Yeah.
But the lessons, well, Europe didn't really seem to learn them properly.
Union versus Confederacy, a brutal chapter. What were the key innovations we saw there, militarily speaking?
The sheer scale of logistics was something else. Both sides used railways massively, moving troops, supplies. The telegraph was vital for command.
Right.
Then you had the weapons. Widespread use of rifled muskets, the mini ball, made infantry fire far deadlier, much longer range. Early machine guns, like the Gatling gun, showed up, though not used much.
Gatling guns, wow.
Even things like balloon reconnaissance for spying. And like in Crimea, organized ambulance corps started appearing, trying to deal with the casualties.
It sounds like a testing ground for modern war tech. So why didn't European military observers really get it? Why didn't they see the implications for their own wars?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Many European officers looked at it through their own lens, their own doctrines, their own context. They dismissed, oh, that's just citizen soldiers, militias, fighting in weird American terrain, not like our professional armies. They clung to this idea of quick, decisive battles, maneuver warfare.
So they ignored the long, bloody sieges.
Or saw them as exceptions, yeah. They saw the tech, sure, but didn't fully grasp how it would force warfare into trenches, into this grinding attrition. There's maybe a bit of professional snobbery, believing their way was inherently better. That failure to adapt, well, it cost them dearly in 1914.
A sobering thought. How entrenched ideas can be so dangerous.
Mm.
Okay, let's move back to Europe, late 19th century. The wars of unification, imperial expansion. Feels like the pressure cooker is really starting to heat up now.
Absolutely. The Austro-Prussian War, 1866. Perfect example. Short war, but massive consequences. Austria versus Prussia, fighting for dominance over the German states.
And Bismarck is pulling the strings here, right? Aiming for a Germany led by Prussia.
Exactly. Master manipulator. Made alliances, including with Italy, to isolate Austria. The Prussians won decisively at Königgrätz or Sadowa. Better organization, better strategy, and crucially those new breech-loading rifles. Much faster firing.
And the result totally redrew the map of Central Europe.
Fundamentally, the old German Confederation, gone. Replaced by the North German Confederation, led by Prussia, Austria shut out. Prussia grabbed key territories. It cemented Prussian dominance in the north, paved the way for German unification in 71.
And Austria.
Austria, now out of German affairs, turned its focus southeast towards the Balkans, which eventually led to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This whole shift created new tensions, new rivalries, and directly fed into the alliance systems that would clash later. A textbook case of realpolitik, power politics.
So a powerful, unified Germany emerges, Austria's weakened and looking elsewhere. Yeah, you can see how that might cause trouble down the line. And then just a few years later, boom. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870-71.
Yes, this was Bismarck's final move for unification. He basically goaded France into declaring war, which pulled the southern German states into alliance with Prussia against France.
And another quick, decisive win for the Prussians and their allies, capture of Napoleon III, the Siege of Paris.
Absolutely. And the peace treaty, the Treaty of Frankfurt, was harsh. France had to give up Alsace, a part of Lorraine territories with huge symbolic value, plus pay a massive indemnity.
Oh.
This defeat crushed French power and prestige in Europe. But more than that, it created this deep-seated bitterness, this desire for revenge, revanchism, especially over Alsace-Lorraine. That feeling drove French foreign policy for decades, pushing them towards alliances, especially with Russia, specifically to counter Germany.
So the war didn't just make Germany dominant, it created this permanent source of tension, this wound between France and Germany. And tech played a big part again.
Oh, definitely. The Prussians used railways brilliantly for mobilization. That really influenced military planners everywhere, like with the later Schlieffen Plan. Their Krupp artillery guns were devastating. The French actually had better rifles, the chassepot, and an early machine gun, the mitrailleuse. But their tactics were often outdated, so they didn't get the full benefit. Plus, the Prussian general staff system, their planning, Their use of the telegraph for command, it was just superior. It showed it wasn't just about having the tech, but how you organized and used it.
It's really clear how these wars are building on each other, creating this more unstable Europe. Let's shift east again. The Russo-Turkish War, 1877-78. Back to the Ottomans.
Exactly. Russia still had ambitions in the Balkans, still wanted influence there, partly under the banner of pan-Slavism, supporting fellow Slavs. Plus, they wanted to recover from the Crimean War losses, get naval power back in the Black Sea. The Ottomans were weak, struggling financially. It was an opportunity.
And the war went pretty well for Russia initially.
Militarily, yes. They pushed deep into the Balkans, won key battles in the Caucasus.
But the peace treaty they imposed, San Stefano, that caused a big stir with the other European powers.
It really did. San Stefano proposed creating this huge Bulgarian state, basically under Russian influence. Britain and Austria-Hungary, especially, saw that as giving Russia way too much power in a critical region, threatening their own interests.
So they pushed back.
Yep. Led to the Congress of Berlin. They basically rewrote the treaty. Bulgaria was made much smaller. Austria-Hungary got the right to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina. Remember that name?
Yeah.
Britain got Cyprus.
So Russia won the war but kind of lost the peace, diplomatically. And redrawing the Balkan map like that must have had huge long-term effects.
Massive.
Yeah.
And deeply destabilizing. The Congress of Berlin tried to create peace, but by ignoring a lot of the local national aspirations, drawing lines on maps,
Yeah.
it just created new problems, new resentments.
Right.
It intensified rivalries between the Balkan states themselves and between Austria-Hungary and Russia over influence there. It basically supercharged the powder keg. Those unresolved tensions. They lead directly towards the Balkan Wars and ultimately Sarajevo.
It feels like every solution just plants the seeds for the next conflict. Okay, let's jump across the globe again. Spanish-American War, 1898. Short war, but big consequences.
Very big. You had American sympathy for Cuban rebels fighting Spain, fueled by sensationalist yellow journalism, and then the USS Maine sinking in Havana Harbor.
Right, remember the Maine.
Exactly. Plus a long-standing U.S. desire to push European powers out of the Americas.
A splendid little war, they called it, from the U.S. side anyway. What were the main outcomes? Why was it such a global turning point?
Well, it finished off Spain's colonial empire, basically. And it announced the arrival of the United States as a major world power. Not just regional, but global, especially in the Pacific and the Caribbean.
Because the U.S. Cuba became a protectorate, but they got Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines.
That's it. This sudden American empire intensified rivalries with other imperial powers, especially Germany, who also had Pacific ambitions. And it really kick-started the growth of the U.S. Navy into a global force, a major shift in the world balance.
And military tech kept evolving here, too.
Yep. This war really highlighted this shift to repeating rifles using smokeless powder, much faster rate of fire, more accurate. The U.S. Army adopted the Craig-Jorgensen. And interestingly, first military use of X-rays for finding bullets in wounded soldiers, a medical first.
Wow. So Spain out, America in, tech marches on. Okay, early 20th century now. Things are feeling really close to the edge. The Second Boer War, 1899-1902.
A really nasty, drawn-out colonial war. Britain versus the two independent Boer republics in South Africa, driven by British imperial aims, gold discoveries, Boer nationalism, and complaints from British settlers there, the Uitlanders.
And it wasn't the quick walkover the British expected, was it?
Not at all. The Boers were tough fighters, great marksmen, used guerrilla tactics effectively with modern rifles. They gave the British Army a real bloody nose initially.
So Britain had to adapt.
They did. They poured in massive reinforcements, eventually overwhelmed the Boers, but it took years. And it involved really brutal tactics, including the infamous concentration camps for Boer civilians, which caused a huge outcry back home and internationally. The human cost was terrible, especially for Boer women and children.
What lessons did Britain, and maybe others, learn from this? How did it foreshadow the First World War?
It was a huge shock to the British system. Showed the cost and difficulty of modern warfare, even against a smaller, supposedly inferior foe. It exposed weaknesses in British tactics and thinking.
Like what specifically?
Well, they were forced to recognize how effective modern rifles were in skilled hands. The Boers had Mausers, Krags. Britain quickly adopted similar rifles like the Lee Enfield. They had to learn about infantry dispersion, spreading out better marksmanship, using cover, coordinating cavalry differently, concealing artillery. You even saw early forms of trench fighting.
So practical lessons.
Very practical, painful lessons. It also showed the kind of national effort, the patriotic fervor and mass volunteering that would be needed for a big European war. In many ways, it was a dry run for the kind of industrial-scale conflict to come. forcing tactical changes that directly influenced how they prepared for war in Europe.
A very harsh wake-up call. Okay, around the same time, the Boxer Rebellion in China, 1899-1901, another international affair.
Yes, this was an anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising in China. The Boxers were fueled by economic problems, anger at foreign influence, and the weakness of the ruling Qing dynasty. They targeted foreigners, missionaries, Chinese Christians.
And it led to that famous siege in Beijing and a big international response.
Exactly. The Boxers besieged the foreign legations in Beijing. This triggered a military intervention by the Eight-Nation Alliance, basically all the major powers: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the U.S., Italy, Austria, Hungary.
Quite the coalition.
They eventually broke the siege after 55 days, put down the rebellion, but there was a lot of looting and violence afterwards.
And the aftermath. What did it mean for China and the global powers?
The Boxer Protocol that followed imposed massive penalties on China. Huge indemnity payments, foreign troops permanently stationed in Beijing. It massively weakened the Qing dynasty, contributing to its overthrow a decade later. It also deepened Chinese resentment of foreign powers and actually intensified the competition between those powers in China, especially Japan, which was really flexing its muscles. It showed how far imperial interests reached and how willing powers were to intervene militarily together when needed. And again, another testing ground for military tech and the challenges of fighting as a coalition.
So these early 20th century conflicts really feel like the final stages setting up the big one. Let's talk about the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905. That seems incredibly significant.
Oh, absolutely pivotal, a watershed moment. The first time in modern history an Asian power defeated a major European power in a full-scale war.
Wow. What was it fought over?
Competing ambitions in Manchuria and Korea. Japan was very worried about Russian expansion, especially Russia controlling Port Arthur on the coast. Negotiations failed, and Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet.
And the Japanese victory just stunned the world, didn't it? Changed perceptions completely.
Totally. It shattered that myth of European invincibility, established Japan as a major world power overnight. For Russia, a disaster. Humiliating defeat, huge costs, helped trigger the 1905 revolution back home. Some historians call it World War Zero.
World War Zero. Why that label?
Because of the scale, the modern nature of the fighting, and its global impact. It really foreshadowed the First World War. You saw massive use of machine guns, rapid-firing artillery. The siege of Port Arthur involved extensive trench warfare, just like the Western Front later.
Really? That early?
Absolutely. Naval battles used modern battleships. Land artillery was used against ships. Innovative tactics like tunneling under fortifications. And the casualties were immense, showing just how deadly modern weapons had become. It forced everyone to rethink military strategy, spurred the naval arms race even further, and Russia's weakness was laid bare.
A stark warning indeed. Okay, two final conflicts right before 1914. The Italo-Turkish War, 1911-12, and then the Balkan Wars, 1912-13.
The Italo-Turkish War. Italy wanted Libya, part of the Ottoman Empire. They saw the Ottomans were weak, got agreement from other powers, and just went for it.
And Italy won fairly easily.
Militarily, yes, though resistance dragged on. But the key thing, Italy's victory further exposed just how weak the Ottomans were, and that directly encouraged the Balkan League, Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro to think, hey, now's our chance. They attacked the Ottomans just months later, kicking off the First Balkan War.
So one war directly triggered the next.
Pretty much. And the Italo-Turkish War was also significant for tech firsts, first aerial bombing from a plane, first use of armored cars in combat, little glimpses of the future.
And then the Balkan Wars themselves. Incredibly messy and with huge repercussions.
Absolutely seismic for the region. Two wars back to back. First, the Balkan League teamed up and basically kicked the Ottomans out of almost all of Europe. Huge success for them.
But they couldn't agree on the spoils.
Exactly. They fell out, mainly over Macedonia.
Yeah.
So the Second Balkan War kicked off, with Bulgaria fighting its former allies, plus Romania and even the Ottomans jumping back in against Bulgaria. Bulgaria lost badly.
So the map of the Balkans is completely redrawn, Ottoman power in Europe shattered. But it didn't bring peace.
Far from it. It created new borders, new states, loads of national pride, but also tons of resentment and competing claims. And critically, Serbia emerged much larger and stronger. This terrified Austria-Hungary.
Why Austria-Hungary specifically?
They feared this strong Serbia would stir up nationalism among the Slavic peoples inside their own empire. That tension between Austria-Hungary and Serbia, fueled by the Balkan War's outcome, that's the direct fuse. It leads straight to Sarajevo, June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by a Serbian nationalist. the spark.
It's almost chilling, isn't it, seeing how each conflict connects to the next, ratcheting up the tension, leading inevitably, it seems, to the Great War.
It really does feel that way in hindsight.
Yeah.
These pre-First World War conflicts weren't isolated incidents. They were all tangled together.
Yeah.
They show the deadliness of new weapons. They reshaped Europe's power balance with Germany's rise. They saw the Ottoman Empire crumble, leaving that Balkan powder keg. New global powers like the U.S. and Japan emerged, adding new rivalries. The lessons learned or maybe mislearned about warfare, technology, mobilization. It all fed into how the First World War started and how it was fought. Add in the crazy nationalism, the rigid alliances. The whole system was just incredibly fragile. A local crisis could go global, and it did.
It really underscores that history isn't just dates and battles, is it? It's this complex web, this flow where everything impacts everything else, sometimes decades later.
Exactly. It makes you really think, doesn't it? How those unresolved issues, those power shifts from these earlier wars, made the big one maybe not just possible, but almost inevitable. And which of these earlier wars, which one do you think had the biggest, maybe most overlooked impact on why the First World War happened the way it did? It's definitely something worth pondering.
Absolutely. A lot to think about there. And it gives such crucial context for understanding 1914. If you, listening, want to explore any of these conflicts further, the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Balkan Wars, there's just so much fascinating history out there to uncover.